Exploring innovation space. We saw in the last film that innovation takes place along a spectrum of novelty. At one end we have incremental innovation, essentially doing what we do but better, improvements, enhancements. At the other end of the spectrum, radical innovation, doing something completely different, big steps, big leaps forward. But we can innovate anywhere along that spectrum. But we also need to think of the direction in which we innovate. What are we going to change and why? And that really raises a question where a compass might be useful. So what we're going to do in this film is very briefly look at some of the different points that we might use on our innovation compass. We can, for example, change what we offer the world. We'll call it our product, but it could be a service as well. Now, in a sense, product innovation is something that involves changes in what we offer. We still use the same spectrum, of course, from incremental change right through to radical, but here we're talking very much about changes in what we offer. So let's look at some examples. We could, for example, look at the famous Bic ballpoint pen. Now, the Bic Cristal is a design which goes right back to the 1950s. At the time, it was a radical innovation, the world's first mass-market, mass-produced ballpoint pen at a fraction of the cost of its earlier rivals. But that's a product that has continued to innovate. It's not just a one-off product innovation. Over many, many years, we've seen incremental improvement innovation, and the product is still very successful today in 2018, selling millions around the world and representing the accumulation of a great deal of incremental, do what we do better innovation. Or the bicycle. Right at the turn of the Industrial Revolution, when people needed a different form of personal transportation, the technologies of ironworking and so on had reached the point where we could think about a personal form of transportation. There was a lot of experimentation around the bicycle, but finally the familiar shape, that diamond frame, emerged, became what's called the dominant design, and we've had bicycles like that ever since. Not just the same as were in the Industrial Revolution, lots of improvement, incremental innovation, but essentially the same pattern. And iTunes, not the first by a long chalk of the MP3 generation, the idea that you could have music in digital format. But what Steve Jobs did with the iPod and the iTunes platform was bring the elements together and make it available, much as Henry Ford did with his car, make it available for everyone. And iTunes changed the face of music. Not forever. We're now seeing other product innovations like Spotify taking that still further. Now we can also change our process, how we create and deliver whatever it is we offer. And here again, what we're talking about, changes in how we create that offering, still involves that same spectrum, from incremental through to radical innovation. Again, let's look at a few examples. If we think about Amazon, what Amazon did was make some fundamental changes to retailing, moving, first of all, books and then many other products from the physical space to the virtual space. Toyota, for many, many years, not the inventor of the motor car, but the developers of a very powerful production system. In post-war Japan, having to be very careful with scarce resources, Toyota and other players developed a different approach to car manufacturing. Process innovation, at first quite radical, but an innovation which has continued to apply, so that there is still continuous improvement, continuous incremental innovation, which have helped Toyota become the world's most productive car maker and stay that way. And the steel industry, the backbone of so much, but steel is a product we have been making for hundreds of years, but our processes for doing so have changed. In the very early days, we chopped down forests, we burned charcoal to get the right sorts of temperatures. Later on, we had the Bessemer converter, and later still many other developments which continue to the present day. Steelmaking, a hugely important area, is subject to occasional radical process innovation and then continuous incremental improvement along that line. Now, there's another way we can innovate. We can change the position, who we offer our product or our service to, the story we tell them, where and how we position our product in people's lives. And that's very important in terms of the marketing dimension of innovation. But once again, we're still talking about that same spectrum, from incremental to radical innovation. Let's look at some more examples. Starbucks, for example, taking the idea of coffee. Well, we've had coffee for a very long time, but Starbucks have changed this from a low-cost commodity product to the kind of thing which right around the world people consume in all sorts of varieties, much like they do with wine, and the whole experience of going to a coffee shop has changed dramatically. Essentially, rethinking the market, not by changing the product, not particularly by modifying the process, fundamentally looking at different ways to tell the story and position coffee in people's lives. Which is something that Henry Ford knew a lot about. Although there was undoubtedly product and process innovation, what he really did was position the motor car away from a luxury product that only a few very wealthy people could afford. He famously produced the car for every man at a price every man can afford. And M-Pesa. In Kenya and much of East Africa, money traffic these days goes across mobile phones. It's a far more developed form of mobile money than we have in much of the Western world. But M-Pesa, originally developed by Vodafone and the British Department for International Development, essentially provides a safe and secure way to move money around to pay for goods and services. It's been so successful, basically speaking to people who wouldn't have a bank account, so a very different shaped market. But it's been so successful that estimates suggest that half or more of the gross domestic product of Kenya now moves across the M-Pesa platform. Position innovation. And there's one other way, one other dimension on our compass that we can innovate. We can change our paradigm, the kind of mental model, the business model that we use. How do we see what it is that we're doing? And when we think about innovation, what is it we want to do to create value? We can change that, once again, incremental to radical, still play with the same spectrum. And if we think of some examples here, well, Airbnb has grown to be one of the largest providers of accommodation in the world, although they don't own a single hotel. What they've done is change the model, essentially move across to take an element out of the sharing economy and build a business out of that. Spotify essentially challenging again the idea that maybe, although we all like music, maybe we don't need to own it. Maybe we'd be happy to rent it. And then doing the product and process innovation to allow a streaming service to operate. And Rolls-Royce, they make very fine jet engines and have done for many, many years. But the Rolls-Royce business model, the paradigm innovation, is essentially one which has changed from selling engines to selling what their users actually want, which is power. And why sell that? Why not do the same as Spotify? Why not rent the power? So the slogan for Rolls-Royce, and indeed for their big competitor General Electric, is that airlines now can get power by the hour. Now these are examples of changing the underlying business model and innovating in ways that meet the customer needs for that. So we can think about this 4 Ps approach as a way of exploring innovation space. We can innovate in any of these directions, and of course in the space in between, not just in the 4 cardinal points of the innovation compass. We can do that in do better fashion, incremental innovation, or we can do it in more radical, do different fashion. We can change, of course, one dimension, but find that that will drive change in other directions as well. For example, the idea of low-cost flying originally was a position innovation. It wasn't about new kinds of aeroplanes or new processes. It asks the question, who doesn't fly yet but might? Who's a potential but underserved market? So by creating an innovation to meet that particular position, they then had to rethink the product offer, particularly keeping this to short, simple flights, point to point rather than long distance, and huge amounts of process innovation to drive the costs down. Innovations like multi-skilling, innovations like reducing turnaround time at airports, all sorts of changes in the way in which payment systems operate, a great deal of innovation going on along the process dimension in order to enable the position innovation. And eventually it becomes a paradigm innovation, low-cost flying has become the new normal for many short-haul airlines. So let's summarize this idea of innovation directions. Direction matters. We can't just innovate randomly all over the place. There are opportunities in 4 key directions: product, process, position, and paradigm, and in the space between them. There are opportunities for incremental and for radical change. And innovating in one direction will often drive innovation in other directions to make that original idea work.